Alex, thank you so much for joining me today. I've had the opportunity to review the YouTube effect. I'm really excited to dig in today on the issues that you outline in that documentary. And first, I want to start with at TecHype, we like to debunk misunderstandings around emerging technologies. And I think that platforms and recommender systems and their business models are pretty opaque for the general audience. I'd love to hear from you. What are three common misunderstandings around these? And if we could frame them in relation to the general public and their misunderstandings. Obviously, we've had the writers and the Actors Guild strikes. There may be misunderstandings. But then also the developers themselves, what are they misunderstanding about what they should be building?
Those are really good questions. And obviously, it's the reason we made the film is obviously YouTube has enormous power, and that includes power for good. It's a vast platform that does many, many, many things. And I think that's probably the first misunderstanding is just what YouTube is. I think there are two core misunderstandings there before you even get into the broader one. Maybe that falls under general. But I think that one of the reasons that YouTube is left out of a lot of the conversations around the influence of these tech platforms on the public is because people don't really know what it does. People think it's a social media platform, which it really isn't. Or they'll think it's just about cat videos or influencers, which it's not just that.
Those were the good old days, Alex, when it was just cat videos.
For about 5 seconds in 2005. What we're really talking about is the largest media platform on the planet by far in terms of the interaction of the public with a tech platform. There are more people watching YouTube than anything else, movies, TV, anything. It's the number 2 most searched web platform on the planet after Google, which is number 1. Both of these are owned by Google. So you have one giant tech monopoly that is controlling most of the web traffic and certainly controlling most of the eyeballs on the planet. And so I think that's how you have to look at YouTube, as this vast media platform that's owned by the largest tech company on the planet. And that creates misunderstandings in many ways. And I'd say that in terms of the general public, I think that the beginning to understand what YouTube does, and one of the reasons we made the movie was we wanted to look at what is the societal impact of a platform that big, for good and ill. And I think so understanding what it does, its positives as well as its negatives, understanding what your kids are doing on it, for positive and negative. I think that there's been, there tends to be an immediate backlash of things that we don't understand or we find scary. And the first inclination is to yank your kids off of these platforms. And I would argue that a lot of the things that are troublesome or problematic that one may find on YouTube can also be solved on YouTube. So I think having a deeper understanding and awareness of what's on these platforms is kind of the first step to wrapping our heads around them, because they're not going away. And I would argue that we don't actually want them to go away. So that would probably be number 1, right? If we're going to move
number 1 on that, and I want to dig into that really quickly before we get into the other two, because in the state of California, they've introduced something called the Age Appropriate Design Code Act. And it was passed into law. And the idea there is that platforms should put in place these safeguards by design.
Right.
I mean, is that too optimistic? Can we do that? And later on in our, I want to get into how people really kind of manipulate the recommender system to be able to get views. And they often do so in ways that can be harmful. So do you think that these age-appropriate design code acts could be very effective?
I'm worried about them. I mean, I personally feel that requiring age verification online in a blanket way removes incredibly important protections for a lot of people, especially youth. There are vulnerabilities to being online, and having to plug your data in to databases over which there's some degree of control and little degree of control can be incredibly dangerous. I wouldn't want my youngest kid. I mean, I'm very careful about him not putting his information online in any form, his email, his name, his birthday, anything. So I'm very wary of age verification systems. And I think that we haven't yet seen meaningful legislation or regulation that would be protective in a good way. But I think we're getting there. I don't think that will be a permanent issue.
Yeah, and you raised this point about this being sort of a safe space for some youth. And also, let's remind everybody that we have a right to anonymity online. It's a First Amendment right. There's a book by Jeff Kosef. I encourage everybody to check it out that talks about this right. So I asked you before the two other groups. So we just have the Writers and Actors Guild strikes. I'm hearing there's maybe some consensus forming. So what's some misunderstandings about the role of platforms and the business models and these recommender systems that you'd like to debunk?
I mean, I think that is really less on the writers and actors, I would say, and more on some of the business leaders in our industry that have that have kind of conflated the rise of the internet and the meaning of clicks with success when it's not actual monetary success in our industry. My industry is not YouTube. We don't have that kind of relationship with studios or with financiers where we make an agreement to be paid a certain. It's not, that's a very basic ad-based model, and YouTube has made very specific monetization moves within their platform in order to get money to the creators based on clicks and their success with subscribers to their channel. Our industry doesn't work that way. There's been a lot of confusion around that. People got very captivated with what the social media reach was of certain movie stars when it did not equate to box office at all. And I think there's been a kind of a speed bump that got hit, which is one of the reasons we're striking, where the talent is saying, look, we get paid very basically on the work we do, residuals for that work, and our likeness. And if you take those things away, then we don't have any way of earning a living. And so I think that's been a big misunderstanding, is sort of equating the rise of these platforms and confusing that with the consumer's appetite. I think the studios have largely assumed that the audience wanted to move 100% online, which I think is not necessarily the case. And certainly if it ends up becoming the case, we'll have to create monetization systems that work specific to our industry that are very different for how they work for YouTube and other internet-based platforms. So I think that's been a huge misunderstanding about the consumer as well as about how these tech platforms work. I don't think the consumer needs to have everything in one place. Consumers are savvy and they are cross-platform. My kids, all the way up to my oldest kid who's 25, has no problem going to the movies, reading a book, going outside, watching YouTube, listening to a record.
Yeah.
All good, right? Doesn't need to get rid of all those things and just stare at a monitor screen all day. I think that's been a big confusion.
Yeah, exactly. And you've made me think of two things. First, how Grimes has actually used this as an opportunity to lease out her likeness. You brought up the point of your right of publicity and your right over your own likeness. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And then let's transition into, you're talking about these incentive mechanisms when they're building their business model and the recommender systems and they're optimizing for eyes on the screen. There's something missed in that, isn't there? So those are my two questions. First, what about licensing your deep fake? And then second, are the developers of these platforms and the recommender systems, is their head in the right place?
Those are really good questions. On the first one, what's hit the snag with the SAG negotiations right now with the AMPTP is they're very, I would say, well-founded concern about the AI agreements and protocols moving forward, and specifically about likeness and specifically about scanning and digital rights to your own likeness. And most actors, and then I would argue a lot of people in the industry, earn a lot of their living off of residuals. And the reason residuals work is because we spend a lot of time not working, developing the next project or auditioning for projects, et cetera. Mm-hmm. Those residuals keep everybody alive. They keep their mortgages paid and their health insurance covered. What happened with Grimes was, and other people who are beginning to try to negotiate around this is, her attitude was, well, I should be in control of my likeness and I should be in control of my digital likeness and have control over how I lease that out or, monetize it, which is a no-brainer. we're in this kind of crisis moment in time where if SAG had said yes and given away the farm, then a lot of different jobs would be lost, not just actors' jobs. So I think it's a very important crossroads we're at, where people are beginning to realize the significance of their digital rights. And that has been something I've been very concerned about for, going on 20 years. And rights to privacy, digital rights, likeness rights, the idea that we live online as an actual destination, your data, your information. You look at some of the recent controversies around the genetic web platforms that are selling off people's, DNA information to the highest bidder. All of these things are connected. I think we're at a moment where we have to start taking responsibility, demanding the ability to have access and ownership over our digital lives. Regarding the second question, I think that everything happened really fast. I think two things, right? I think in one case, to be fair to Google and YouTube, I think Susan Wojcicki and the early visionaries of YouTube were prescient in understanding the power of video and the power of creating kind of a democratized platform that goes all over the world and then monetizing that in an ad-based revenue model. I think what they didn't quite see was when you combine that with recommender algorithms and then an enormous reach beyond anyone's wildest imaginations, that's like rocket fuel for all kinds of things, including disaster. And so I think this combination of auto recommendations or recommendations tailored to your various clicks and your data, and their desire to monetize holding you there, and then 4.6 billion video views a day. I mean, that's just going to created a monster essentially. And so I think that the misunderstanding there, and I think there's still a misunderstanding, is their level of accountability. That if you have a business model where you are making money off of the success of that algorithm, no matter what kind of effect it's having, positive or negative, and in fact, one could argue if you're making more money off of a negative effect, then of course there's responsibility and accountability.
Yep.
That is the really big misunderstanding that's being challenged right now by the tech industry.
Yes, absolutely. And I recently published a piece in Wired with Hani Farid on this idea of holding the platforms accountable for negligent design. I agree with you that when they started to build out YouTube and it was in its early days, it was seen as this utopian technology that would democratize the production of media. But we see that by those incentive mechanisms of the recommender systems of keeping eyes on a screen as long as possible, you end up having these perverse reactions where you have people doing very dangerous stunts just to get clicks. You start to get that clickbait. Do you think that there's going to be a change in YouTube? I mean, your work, your documentary really brings to light these harms. Do you think there's going to be a change?
I do, because I don't think the public will stand for it. And I don't think that there's going to be an immediate change. And I do think there's going to be mistakes made along the way in creating guardrails and protections that end up empowering these companies and disempowering the public that they're trying to protect. And that's unfortunate. But I think that a lot of people, there's a kind of a saying around the tech space right now that we slept on the last 20 years and we can't afford to sleep on the next 20 years. And I think a lot of people in government, in the public, in consumer protection organizations, things like that, both digital and in the regular sector, are really waking up to how these technologies work and what the implications of them are. And so I think we're beginning to see more positive movement in this regard. But gosh, it's going to take time. And do I think that the tech companies are going to police themselves and reorient their companies in order to create better safeguards? Absolutely not. That's 100% not going to happen because they're making money hand over fist, and it's just the incentives to not do that are too great.
Yes, absolutely, Alex. I like to be an eternal optimist, but I share your skepticism, and especially in this space because the industry is essentially self-regulated, and they're doing a very good job of lobbying members of Congress and legislatures to say, we know our system better than anybody else. We know the best way to put in those guardrails. Let us do the hard work. We know better. I agree with you. We need to approach that with a bit of skepticism. And then, if I could, I mentioned before the California Age Appropriate Design Code Act, which was passed into law. And you raised such important points about the protections for children online. That law is being pushed back on by some large groups and filing lawsuits against the state of California that the law violates platforms' First Amendment rights. That's something else we often don't think about, that the platforms, the companies themselves, they also have First Amendment rights. So we have quite a few hurdles to get over on this front.
Yeah, and we didn't even mention Section 230. So yes, we do.
Should we dig into it a little bit? I think we should. Let's get into it really quick. So let me just give a quick primer for the audience on what in the world Section 230 is, and then let's discuss whether or not we think there should be some reforms. So Section 230 was passed in 1996 as part of the Communications Decency Act. At that time, there were several lawsuits as the internet was starting to boom and platforms were starting to growing. There was concern that those platforms would not be able to grow because they would face a significant number of lawsuits because of either defamatory content or whatever posted to their platform. Now, in New York, there were 2 New York Supreme Court cases, both of them pretty similar in their arguments, but fell on different sides. One, because the platform moderated the content, they were deemed liable for the defamatory content. Another, because the platform did not moderate content, they were not held liable. Cox and Wyden, who introduced Section 230 into the Communications Decency Act, said, look, we can't have this, misunderstanding, this ambiguity of what we need to do. And so they wrote in this protection. And Section 230 has 26 words, often referred to as the 26 words that created the internet, where it essentially provides a liability shield for platforms against being held liable for any third-party content. Now, because of that, and I want to make this clear to the audience, there's often a misunderstanding that essentially gives platforms the rights to hold up their hands and not have any moderation, but that's not it at all. It actually empowers them. The purpose of Section 230 is to empower platforms to do the moderation without being held liable, to police their own content. Now, we know in practice and in several lawsuits, the sort of scoping of that has been opened. It's been relaxed quite a bit, where the platforms are not actually policing or moderating the content as best they could. They're turning a blind eye to it. So, Alex, I'd love to hear your take on Section 230. If we need to keep it, we need to reform it, get rid of it. What do you think?
Well, we definitely do not want to get rid of it. You gave such an incredibly compact and clear explanation of what it is. And a lot of people really don't understand 230, and they pound the table and just say kill 230 and everything would be great. It would not be great. It would actually, again, like many of these bad bills that get put forward, it would hurt most of the smaller players who, unlike Google and big tech, don't have buildings filled with lawyers, and they would just go away. The ability for free speech online would be very, very difficult. Pro-abortion organizations, outreach organizations, just basic mom and pop websites, even big websites would be gone. So we don't want to kill 230. We absolutely need to be looking at reforming it for the very simple reason that big tech is not going to police itself, and the harms are very, very real. And I think that, like anything else, like we dealt with the automotive industry, and I know they're very different, so I'm not making an apples to apples comparison here. But they fought and they fought and they fought seatbelts, and they said it was impinging on people's freedom, and people screamed and yelled and said, I don't want this thing in my car. It's impinging on my freedom. Very similar to what we're dealing right now with the argument around 230. And eventually, so many people died that we got seatbelts, and now millions of people's lives are saved because there's a seatbelt in their car. So I think that it's a similar issue where if the harms continue to build, which they are, if now the disinformation and other harms from these platforms are actually, wrecking the democratic process, that's a very big problem. Mm-hmm. And there are a myriad other problems and harms that one could point to. If they can't do that, and they won't do that because the money is coming is too great, well, then we have no choice but to look at reforming areas of liability so that they are able to be held accountable. I think in the short term, we can be suing for individual harms. I think that even if those cases lose, they make a lot of noise. So I think there's a lot of things that can be done. in order to let big tech know that the public does not want to be on the receiving end of harms anymore.
Yeah, exactly. And then to bring this back full circle to your earlier point that when they started to build out YouTube, they didn't necessarily imagine they were building this sort of amplification of extremist content machine. And so it gets back to that idea of design and liability for design. Because if you're building a platform that incentivizes individuals to post harmful spectacle content that gets clicks because we as human beings are prone to pay attention to things that are shocking, should they be able to do that? Or should they actually have to put in place some design standards that don't, incentivize eyes on the screen for as long as humanly possible? So changing up some of the optimization of the recommender systems, I think could go really far.
It could.
What do you think?
Yes, I absolutely think so. And I also think definitions are really important, which is why you're stressing this word design. The big argument, the big First Amendment argument in favor of not touching these platforms, in my opinion, relies on a faulty definition narrative, which big tech has been very savvy in propagating. We saw with X and Twitter, this idea that these platforms are a town hall, right? That they're just a communal space, right? For the public to convene and speak openly. And that if you silence someone in this communal space, then you're removing their First Amendment protected right to free speech, which is just not how these things work. And I
exactly.
I think it betrays just a lack of understanding of what these things are, which they are businesses. And they are businesses that have been designed to monetize your engagement. And that's a very specific definition that falls outside this idea of a communal space and what's protected by the First Amendment. So I really think we have to start by educating the public and giving them some immediate internet literacy and understanding what these platforms are. When Elon Musk bought X, I left immediately. I wasn't censoring somebody by not engaging with them anymore. I was leaving somebody's private company that I didn't agree with.
That's the point. It's a private company. The First Amendment only applies to government suppression of speech.
Yeah.
So yes, the platform, if they block you, remove you, moderate you, that's not your First Amendment right. Now, if there's a law that says that they have to do that, now that could be a violation of your First Amendment right because it's via law. But
that's right.
You're spot on. It's a private sector. It's not the public sphere. Alex, I really encourage everybody to check out the YouTube effect. But before we sign off here, I'd love to hear from you. What's next? What's in the works for you? And what do you want people to be, cognizant of in the TecHype area?
Well, I'm working, very much on helping folks who are hurting during the strike, which is a really big deal. I'm working on my new projects, which I will get started on in earnest once the strike is fully over. But we're in pre-production on those things. I mean, I think that AI, what people call AI, even though it's kind of a loose term for an enormous myriad of machine learning tools, is really something that people have to be looking at. I think it's a mistake to assume that it won't be coming for your job or impinging on your life in a meaningful way, and in a lot of good ways, just like any other tech. It's a giant swath of new technology, so it's not. This idea that AI are just like killer robots is a misunderstanding as well. But I do think that it's going to impact labor in a major, major way. And it's going to cause enormous disruption, not the good kind, in a major way of a lot of areas of labor. So I think people should be paying much closer attention. And again, just like what we just discussed with these misunderstandings around YouTube, understanding what machine learning tools are. If you're just calling them AI, it betrays immediately that you don't understand it, which is fine. It's early.
I couldn't agree with you more, Alex. So best friends now.
So let's get started on literacy and begin to understand what these things are, what they aren't, and how they will impact us.
Great. And with that, that's the best segue to us encouraging the audience to check out our other TecHype episodes and our TecHype deep dives, where we do a deep dive into what in the world is AI and why are Alex and I so concerned that it be referred to as machine learning and not AI. So, Alex, thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you.
Yeah, appreciate it.